For Indigenous Peoples Day, I want to talk about Black indigeneity. No, not in a conspiracy theory way that says something like Africans made tunnels under the Atlantic Ocean and came to the Americas 5,000 years ago, and then now that's just who we are. I mean, in a way in which the African American ethnicity, experience, and encompassing culture and languages, internal dialects, create their own indigenous culture. There isn't one hard definition of indigeneity or being an indigenous person. The first step is just to define what it means to be indigenous. Even the UN that has the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples does not have an actual definition for indigeneity. But just to help understand who that declaration applies to, they do have like some type of framework. But the core of it is that you self-identify as an indigenous person with this context. There must be historical continuity with pre-colonial or pre-settler societies, distinct social, economic, or political systems, distinct language, culture, and beliefs, and form non-dominant groups of society. But also, this is a long one, resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. Now, the first part, which is historical continuity, is the part that's a little bit more dicier for us as African Americans. But because we are stolen people from a faraway land who brought our cultures, who brought our languages, who brought our belief systems, and then still found a way to blend them into Native and European traditions, our culture is one that it kind of sprouted out at the same time as the settler colonialism, but it does not originate from it, because African American culture is constantly and always will be, regardless of people who are trying to assimilate, will always be counterculture to the dominant American society. The first African was brought to these lands in 1501, very much contrary to the 1619 project. And in fact, the writer Gerald Hone breaks down why the 1619 project is pretty ahistorical, to the point that it's trying to create an identity out of African Americanism that is in tangent with the American colonial society, when we have always existed against it. We have existed in spite of it. We are not a part of the American project. The American project is constantly stepping on us and constantly suppressing us. When Africans were brought here, we were immediately able to start cultivating the land. We learned some practices from indigenous peoples, but we also brought our own cultivation project. So although those projects were not necessarily sprout out of the what we now call American land, it became intertwined with it. There were also escaped Africans who we would call maroons, who would run away into the woods, into the swamps, into the mountains, and survive there. Again, able to cultivate the land as if it was their own land in Africa, and did not live in conflict with the land. I think that's so important. Africans tried their best. It depends on where they were in the continental US. But also in the Caribbean and in Latin America, a lot of Africans fought to maintain their heritage. The African American dialect is a dialect that is directly from West Africa. Our English may not be as pidgin as it once was, but I'm sure you can find your. But I'm sure just a study into African American dialect and into how our grandparents spoke, talk to your elders, listen to their accent, listen to their dialects, and notice how it is so different from how we speak today. And as far as beliefs, hoodoo is a variation of African religion. It is a melding of local indigenous traditions, African traditions, and Christianity. As is voodoo, Christian churches around the colonies and around the states blended African traditions with Christianity, forms of root work and ancestral veneration. And as far as forming non-dominant groups in a society, it is important to note there is domination via culture and there's domination via population. But it is the domination via culture which matters the most, such as during South African apartheid, where the white South Africans may have been minorities, but they held all of the cultural power. In the United States, African Americans are also the minority, but also not the dominant culture. Our culture is constantly under attack by whiteness. Our culture is constantly demeaned by whiteness. We are constantly told that we have no culture. And again, as the years go on, we are absolutely losing what makes us a separate culture. And that does not mean we're ever going to be accepted into American culture, but it does mean that we are trying. And I'm saying we, not as in me, because I don't want that, but the dominant parts of African American culture, the celebrities, the corporates, the capitalists, the wannabe capitalists, are pushing to assimilate. We're not even the main holders, the main people who benefit from our own culture anymore, because again, it's become very corporate. But even then, we still know that we have a separate culture, as long as we fight to maintain it, that is not the dominant form of culture in the United States. And people will absolutely try to dispute this because rap is popular, right? Like Black movies are becoming more popular, but that does not mean you are a part of the dominant society, because you can be a rapper all day, but do you actually hold power over white culture? And there's something to be said about like somebody with money, but it's not their culture that's holding power over you, it's their systemic position as somebody with money, with capital. Now, the last one, which is the one that says resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. And then that one is, of course, the one that's a doozy, because we aren't on what was our ancestors' ancestral land. Our ancestors' ancestral land was somewhere in Africa, but as members of the African diaspora that were stolen from the lands that we were from, we don't know what those ancestral lands are over there, but we do know where our great great grandparents, where people were first bought. We kind of know, depending on your census records, where these people were, right? And they were here. My family has been in Georgia and Florida for multiple generations. So while it may not be a deep set ancestral land, it is my ancestry. It's also complicated by the relationship between city African Americans and rural African Americans, who may still have some type of relationship, closer relationship with the land, who may have some type of close relationship simply with like horticulture, gardening, farming, with the animals around them, with hunting. So for me, as someone who had family in Quincy, Florida, we would go down there for the summers and my uncles would catch fish and then the women would clean the fish and we would have us a good old fish fry. And traditions like that are something that keeps the family going. It's something you're supposed to pass on from generation to generation. It was passed on from generation to generation. And again, I can understand how this all sounds like a stretch. I am glad to like talk to people about it. There are also essays on this. There's a bunch of academic work on this. So like let's use Google and like read about it and talk about it. But I think people get confused when you say, oh, displaced person, because they think the remedy is automatically, well, you go back to where your people came from. But the African American, pretty much any diasporic African in the Americas has a different experience than recently displaced people, right? This is our home. This land is our land. And while, yes, a lot of people do want to go back to Africa, a lot of people want to go back home, but at the same time, this has also become our home. And so when we think about it, we say we're displaced peoples. And also, again, this is where our culture actually does originate from. Africa is the mother of our culture, and this culture, which is specific to us, was born here. And this is also not to erase indigenous Americans. And this conversation also does not erase indigenous Americans and Native Americans. It is, again, to start the conversation about like, okay, so what actually does this post-colonial world look like on this land? How do we all fit in? How do we all get reparations for the things we need reparations for? And then how do we come back, share, and cultivate the land and cultivate more culture? How do we get the land back?